Ryan checked his watch for the third time in the last 10 minutes. His jaw tightened as he stared at the empty chair across from him. He was being stood up. He exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his dark brown hair. He should have seen this coming. Blind dates were a terrible idea, and yet he'd let his best friend Mark convince him to give it a shot. "She's perfect for you," Mark had said. "Just one dinner, what's the worst that could happen?" Apparently this. The restaurant was busy, couples laughing over candlelit tables, soft music playing in the background, silverware clinking against plates. Ryan felt ridiculous sitting alone, waiting for a woman who clearly wasn't coming. He had half a mind to stand up, pay for his untouched drink, and leave until his gaze drifted to the table next to him. She was alone, too. A woman with long, chestnut brown hair sat at the neighboring table, stirring the ice in her glass with her straw. She had a small frown on her lips, her deep hazel eyes scanning the room as if she were waiting for someone too. She looked disappointed. Ryan hesitated, his fingers tapping against the table. He wasn't the type to approach strangers, especially not after the disaster of this evening, but something about her expression struck him, like she knew exactly how he was feeling. Before he could second-guess himself, he cleared his throat. "Bad night." The woman blinked, surprised by the sudden interaction. Then, after a pause, she let out a small, humorless laugh. "You could say that." Ryan tilted his head. "Stood up," she sighed, glancing at her untouched plate. "Something like that," he nodded, lifting his beer. "Welcome to the club." For the first time that night, she smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was enough to make something shift in his chest. "Ryan," he offered, leaning slightly toward her. "Sophie," she replied. "Nice to meet you, Sophie." He glanced at her table. "If you don't mind me saying, it seems like a shame to let that dinner go to waste." She raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting we share a pity meal?" He chuckled. "I prefer to think of it as salvaging the night." Sophie studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether or not he was worth the effort. Finally, she exhaled and gestured toward the empty chair across from her. "Why not? It's better than sitting here alone." Ryan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his drink, moved to her table, and within seconds, the strange loneliness he'd been feeling all evening started to fade. Their conversation started slow, just polite small talk, where they were from, what they did for work. But before long, it turned into something else, something easy. Sophie was funny, sharp-witted, and had a way of making him forget why he'd been so annoyed just 30 minutes ago. She told him about her job as a freelance writer, how she loved spending hours in coffee shops, people watching while she worked. He told her about his career in architecture, how he loved designing things that would last long after he was gone. "I like that," she mused, resting her chin on her hand. "Creating something permanent, something that matters." Ryan felt warmth spread through his chest. He hadn't expected to enjoy this night, but here he was, drawn to a woman he'd never met before. Sophie took a sip of her wine, then set her glass down with a teasing smile. "So, tell me, Ryan, do you always end up dining with strangers, or am I just special?" He smirked. "You're definitely special." Her cheeks flushed slightly, and for some reason that made his heart race. The restaurant had started to empty out, but neither of them seemed to care. The longer they talked, the more Ryan felt something unfamiliar creeping up on him, something like anticipation. He didn't want this night to end. Sophie glanced at the time on her phone and sighed. "It's late." Ryan wasn't ready to say goodnight. "Walk with me." She hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." They left the restaurant together, the cool night air wrapping around them as they strolled down the quiet street. Their hands brushed once, twice, until Ryan finally gave in and took hers in his. He half expected her to pull away, but she didn't. Instead, she squeezed his fingers lightly, as if testing the weight of this moment between them. Ryan had no idea where this was going, but for the first time in a long time, he wanted to find out. The city hummed around them, the distant sound of cars, the occasional laughter from a passing group, the faint music spilling out from late-night cafes. But for Ryan, all of it faded into the background. The only thing he was aware of was the warmth of Sophie's hand in his. It was strange, this pull between them. He wasn't the type to believe in fate, in serendipitous meetings that changed everything. And yet, as they walked together through the quiet streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that this night was meant to happen. Sophie swung their joined hands slightly, glancing up at him with a smirk. "You don't usually do this, do you?" Ryan arched a brow. "What, walk women home after they've been stood up?" She laughed, shaking her head. "No, I mean, the whole spontaneous thing, you seem like someone who likes a plan." He considered that. She wasn't wrong, he liked structure, predictability. He was the guy who made dinner reservations a week in advance, who never missed a meeting, who had his life mapped out in a way that made sense. And yet, here he was, walking through the city with a woman he'd just met, feeling more alive than he had in years. "Maybe you're a bad influence," he said, glancing at her with a teasing smile. Sophie grinned. "Or maybe you needed a little spontaneity." They reached the entrance of a small park, the kind with winding paths and benches tucked beneath old street lamps. Without thinking, Ryan gently tugged her toward it. She hesitated. "You planning on luring me into a dark park?" he chuckled. "I promise, no ulterior motives." She gave him a mock suspicious look, but let him lead her in. The path was lined with trees, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The air smelled like rain, though the sky remained clear. It was the kind of night that felt untouched, like it belonged only to them. They reached a bench, and Sophie sat down first, pulling her coat tighter around her. Ryan sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sophie exhaled, tilting her head back to look at the sky. "It's funny, isn't it?" He turned to her. "What is? How things work out?" She glanced at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "If my date had shown up, or if yours had, we would have never met." Ryan studied her, the way the soft glow of the street lamp turned her hair a deep auburn, the way her eyes searched his like she was waiting for him to say something that mattered. "I'm glad they didn't," he admitted. Something flickered in her expression. Surprise, maybe, or something deeper. He reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear before he could stop himself. He felt her breath catch, saw the way her lips parted slightly. It would be so easy to kiss her. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned back, his pulse thrumming in his ears. Sophie let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "This is crazy," Ryan smiled. "A little." She turned toward him, her knee brushing against his. "Tell me something real." He frowned slightly. "Like what?" "Something you don't normally tell people." He hesitated, then exhaled. "I don't do this. I don't meet strangers and feel like I've known them forever." Sophie's expression softened. "Me neither." A moment passed, heavy with something unspoken. Then she stood, brushing off her coat. "I should probably head home." Ryan stood with her, not wanting this night to end. "Where do you live?" "Not far, just a few blocks from here." "I'll walk you." She didn't argue. They walked in silence for a while, the quiet stretching between them, comfortable and charged all at once. When they reached her building, she turned to face him, biting her lip. "Well, this is me." Ryan shoved his hands in his pockets, reluctant to say goodnight. Tonight was unexpected. She smiled. The best things usually are. He wanted to ask if he could see her again, wanted to make sure this wasn't just a fleeting moment. But something told him that if this was meant to be, it wouldn't slip away. Instead, he took a step closer, brushing his fingers against hers. "Good night, Sophie." She held his gaze for a moment before exhaling softly. "Good night, Ryan." And then, before he could second-guess it, she stood on her toes and pressed a soft, fleeting kiss to his cheek. By the time he processed it, she was already walking inside, disappearing behind the door. Ryan stood there for a long moment, his hand brushing over the spot where her lips had been. He had no idea what just happened. All he knew was that he wanted more. Ryan hadn't been able to stop thinking about her. It had been 3 days since that unexpected night, and yet Sophie lingered in his mind like a song he couldn't shake. Every detail replayed the way she laughed, the warmth of her hand in his. the way she had kissed his cheek before disappearing behind that door. He had never felt this kind of pull toward someone before. It wasn't just attraction, it was something deeper, something unsettling in a way that made him crave more. He had debated whether to reach out, whether to try and find her, but there had been no exchange of numbers, no promise of a second meeting. Their night had existed in a fragile, perfect bubble, and he wasn't sure if breaking it would ruin everything or make it even better, until fate decided for him. Ryan had been rushing through the doors of his usual coffee shop when he spotted her. Sophie. She was sitting near the window, a notebook open in front of her, pen tapping absently against the page as she stared into the distance, lost in thought. His breath hitched, and for a moment he considered walking away. What if she didn't want to see him? What if that night had meant something only to him? But then, as if sensing him, she glanced up and froze. For a second, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, a smile tugged at her lips. "Ryan," she said, closing her notebook. He approached cautiously, heart pounding in a way that made no sense. "Sophie." Her eyes searched his as if trying to decide what to say. "You found me." He huffed a quiet laugh. "You make it sound like I went on some wild search across the city," she smirked. "Did you?" He slid into the chair across from her. "Maybe." Her smile deepened, and something inside him eased. "So," she mused, leaning forward, "what brings you here?" "I could ask you the same thing," she shrugged. "I come here a lot, it's my thinking spot." He glanced at her open notebook. "Writer things." "Something like that." She tilted her head. "And you, do you always frequent coffee shops disguised as fate?" Ryan chuckled. "Only when it leads to interesting reunions." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them thickened. "I thought about you," she admitted quietly, his pulse kicked up. "Yeah." Sophie nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I wasn't sure if I'd ever see you again." He leaned forward slightly. "And now that you have." A slow smile spread across her face. "I'm not mad about it." Ryan's chest tightened, something warm and unfamiliar settling in his gut. He wasn't used to this, the unpredictability, the quiet thrill of not knowing what came next. But with Sophie, it felt right. "Have dinner with me," he said suddenly, her brows lifted. "Is this your way of making up for our terrible first dates?" "Something like that." She pretended to consider. I don't know, I have a strict rule about dining with strangers." He smirked. "We're not strangers anymore." She tapped a finger against her chin. "True." "In that case, I suppose I could be persuaded." Ryan grinned. "Tonight," she laughed softly. "Eager, aren't you? You have no idea." Sophie studied him, as if trying to decipher something unspoken. Then, finally, she nodded. "All right, tonight." Relief coursed through him, surprising in its intensity. "Good." She grabbed a napkin, scribbled something down, and slid it across the table. "My number, in case you decide to disappear again." Ryan took it, folding it carefully before slipping it into his pocket. "Not a chance." She shook her head, amused, before standing and gathering her things. "See you at 7 then," he nodded. 7. With one last lingering glance, she walked away, leaving behind the scent of vanilla and something that felt dangerously close to hope. Ryan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Tonight couldn't come fast enough. Ryan stood outside Sophie's apartment building, his heart pounding harder than it had any right to. He had been on countless dates before, some good, some forgettable, but none had ever made him feel like this. Like something big was about to happen, like the night ahead might change everything. The door swung open before he could knock, and there she was. Sophie. She wasn't dressed extravagantly, just a simple burgundy dress that hugged her curves in a way that made his throat dry. Her hair was pulled back, a few loose strands framing her face. But it wasn't her outfit that made his breath catch. It was the way she looked at him, like she had been waiting for him. Like she was just as affected by this as he was. "You're early," she teased, leaning against the doorframe. Ryan smirked, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Couldn't help myself." She rolled her eyes, but he didn't miss the way her lips twitched. "Smooth. You ready?" She grabbed her coat, locking the door behind her. "Let's go." The restaurant was small, tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. It wasn't flashy or overly romantic, but the dim lighting and the soft hum of conversation made it feel intimate. Perfect. They were seated in the corner, the flickering candle casting shadows across Sophie's face. She toyed with the edge of her napkin, glancing at him with a small smile. "So let's get this out of the way. Any horrible exes I should be warned about, secret families, criminal past," Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. "No secret families, no criminal record, exes." "Well, I have them, but nothing dramatic." She arched a brow. "That's disappointing. I was hoping for a scandal." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "What about you?" She hummed, pretending to think. "No secret families either, no criminal record. Exes, just one serious one, ended a year ago." Ryan studied her. And what? Was it bad?" Sophie hesitated, then shrugged. "It wasn't dramatic, just wrong. We wanted different things, and in the end we realized we weren't meant to be." Ryan nodded slowly. "And what do you want now?" Her eyes met his, something unreadable flickering in them. "I don't know yet, but I like this." His pulse quickened. "Me too." Dinner passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and stolen glances. Every time their hands brushed, every time she looked at him like that, Ryan felt something tighten in his chest. By the time they left, the city had quieted, the night air crisp. They walked side by side, their arms occasionally brushing. "Do you always take women on dates to hidden little restaurants?" she asked, tilting her head towards him. Ryan smirked. "Only the ones I want to impress." She gave him a playful shove. "So I'm special." His smile softened. "Yeah, you are." She looked away, but not before he caught the way her cheeks flushed. They reached her building too quickly. Ryan wasn't ready for the night to end, but he also wasn't the kind of guy to push. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I had fun tonight." "Me too." A beat of silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Then, before he could think too hard about it, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. She inhaled sharply, her lips parting slightly. He could kiss her. He wanted to. But he didn't. Instead, he ran his thumb lightly along her cheekbone, savoring the way she leaned into his touch. "Good night, Sophie," he murmured. She exhaled, her gaze dropping to his lips for the briefest second before she stepped back. "Good night, Ryan." And just like that, she disappeared inside, leaving Ryan standing there, his heart hammering in his chest. He wasn't sure what this was. All he knew was that he wanted more. Ryan had never been the type to get caught up in what-ifs. He liked certainty, plans, things that made sense. But Sophie had turned all of that upside down, and now, all he could think about was her. It had been weeks since that first night, weeks filled with laughter, stolen moments, and a connection that felt too big to be ignored. They weren't rushing anything, but at the same time, it was impossible to deny the pull between them. Ryan had tried to fight it at first, tried to tell himself he was imagining it. But every time he saw her, every time she smiled at him like he was the only person in the world, he knew this wasn't something he could walk away from, and that scared the hell out of him. He wasn't afraid of relationships. He had been in them before, had loved before. But this was different. This felt like standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he was ready to fall. But Sophie made it impossible not to. She was unpredictable, challenging in a way that made him want to chase her just to keep up. She could turn a simple conversation into an adventure, could make even the smallest moments feel like something bigger. And now, standing outside her apartment, Ryan knew he was in deep. She opened the door before he could knock, a teasing smile already in place. "You're early again." He smirked, leaning against the doorframe. "You're surprised." "Not really." She tilted her head, studying him like she was trying to read something in his expression. "You okay?" Ryan hesitated for half a second before nodding. "Yeah." "Just thinking." Sophie arched a brow. "Dangerous habit." He chuckled, but the weight in his chest didn't ease. She stepped aside, letting him in. The apartment smelled like cinnamon and something warm, something that felt like home. It was small but cozy, books stacked in random places, a half-finished cup of coffee on the counter. It was so perfectly her. Ryan had been here before, but tonight it felt different. She studied him as he walked inside, her arms crossing loosely. "All right, spill." "What's on your mind?" He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "This," her brows furrowed. "This," he turned to face her fully. "Us." For a second, she didn't move. Then she took a slow step toward him. "What about us?" Ryan wasn't sure how to put it into words, this feeling that had been building inside him for weeks. "I didn't expect this, Sophie." A small, almost wary smile played on her lips. "Neither did I." He shook his head, frustration laced in his voice, not at her but at himself. "I don't do this. I don't meet someone and feel like." "Like what?" she prompted, her voice softer now. "Like I can't breathe when I'm not around them," he admitted, his voice rougher than he intended. "Like nothing makes sense unless you're in it." Sophie's breath hitched, her eyes searching his. He took another step closer, closing the space between them. "I don't know what this is, Sophie. But I know I want it, and that scares the hell out of me." Something in her expression shifted, as if she'd been waiting for him to say it. "Me too." Ryan exhaled, some of the tension in his chest loosening. "Yeah," she nodded, her gaze never leaving his. "I wasn't looking for this, Ryan. I didn't think I could feel this way again." His jaw tightened. "Did someone hurt you?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not in the way you're thinking. My last relationship, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't right, either. And when it ended, I convinced myself that maybe love just wasn't for me." Ryan reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "And now," Sophie swallowed hard, gripping his hand like it was the only thing keeping her steady. "And now I'm terrified." He understood that more than he could say. But fear had never stopped him before. Ryan lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles. "Then let's be terrified together." A small, shaky laugh escaped her. "That might be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." His lips quirked. "I have my moments." She looked at him for a long time, something deep and unspoken passing between them. Then finally, she exhaled and stepped closer, resting her forehead against his chest. Ryan wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know if they would crash and burn or if this would be the thing that changed everything. But for the first time in his life, he was willing to find out. Ryan never believed in fate, but sitting here now, watching Sophie curled up against him on her couch, he was starting to think the universe had a way of making things happen exactly when they were supposed to. The city lights flickered through the window, casting a soft glow over her face as she absent-mindedly traced patterns on his forearm. They had spent hours talking, learning the quiet details about each other that didn't come up in casual conversation. He knew now that she hated the sound of ticking clocks, that she had a habit of biting her lip when she was lost in thought, that she loved thunderstorms but was terrified of deep water. And with every little thing he learned, he felt himself falling deeper. Sophie let out a small sigh, shifting slightly to glance up at him. "You're quiet." Ryan smirked, running his fingers through her hair. "Just thinking." "About," he hesitated, then exhaled. "You," her lips twitched. "Dangerous habit," he chuckled, shaking his head. "You keep saying that, because it's true." She tapped a finger against his chest. "You, Ryan Carter, are a man who likes control, and I have a feeling I'm messing with that." "You are." Sophie stilled, the teasing glint in her eyes fading into something softer. "And you don't hate it?" Ryan studied her, his fingers brushing lightly over her cheek. "No, I don't." Her breath caught, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then, hesitantly, she whispered, "What are we doing, Ryan?" He swallowed hard. "Falling." Something flickered in her expression, fear, hope, maybe both. "And what happens when we hit the ground?" Ryan tightened his grip around her waist, pulling her closer. "Then we hold on." Sophie exhaled shakily, searching his gaze for something, though he wasn't sure what. He only knew that he couldn't let her doubt this knot when it felt more real than anything else ever had. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her bottom lip. I don't do this, Sophie. I don't let people in easily. But you. You walked into my life and suddenly nothing else makes sense without you in it. Her eyes shimmered, her fingers curling around the front of his shirt. Ryan. Tell me you feel it too, he murmured, his voice low, almost pleading. She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. Of course I do, you idiot. Relief crashed over him, and before he could think twice, he leaned in, capturing her lips in a slow, deep kiss. Sophie melted into him instantly, her fingers threading through his hair as she pressed closer. The kiss was unhurried, filled with the weight of everything they had been building toward. It wasn't about passion, not just about passion. It was about something much bigger. When they finally pulled back, Ryan rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. I'm all in, he whispered. No second guessing, no holding back. Sophie closed her eyes for a moment before nodding. Me too. A slow smile spread across his face as he cupped her jaw, tilting her face up to his. Good, she grinned, shaking her head. You really don't like to lose, do you? Not when it comes to you. She kissed him again, laughing against his lips, and Ryan knew without a doubt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Sophie was unexpected, unpredictable, and absolutely, completely his.